You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next half an hour, we're going to be playing a bit of What If again, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
You don't have to lean into the microphone. Elton John, did you say?
Okay, do you want to start again?
No, we're recording on the video, right?
I don't care.
Okay. Do you know, last time, at the end of the last one, John's not heard it yet, so he doesn't know. At the end of the last one, I jokingly said, what if Ridley Scott hadn't been on holiday when they'd have made the Daleks? Would the Daleks have been back? Because with that design, and I only said it as a joke, and I didn't really mean it to be, but then it struck me afterwards. I used the title Change Without Renewal for the first one, and it struck me that the title Daleks Without Destiny would be a great title for the second one, and I thought the only way you can do that is if you do ask the question about Ridley Scott. So here I am. I'm not asking what would have happened, because if Ridley Scott had been there to design the Daleks, they wouldn't have been the same Daleks as we had. And so I don't think there would have been the clamour for them to come back. So let's, instead of asking what would have happened if Ridley Scott had been there, let's pose the question this way instead. What would have happened if the Daleks had just made one appearance and Doctor Who had somehow survived for 3 years and then the Cybermen had taken off in the way the Daleks did instead? So we get a bunch of Cyberman stories, but I guess what I'm really asking, and I guess I'll come to you first, John, because you weren't on the last episode, so this is your first opportunity. Do you think the Cybermen could have took off in the way the Daleks did? And had that been the case, do you think we'd have had some of the iconic Cybermen stories with the Cybermen that we have had over the years with the Daleks instead?
I don't think so. I think for the pure reason that the Cybermen haven't got that same resonance to the audience at the time. You know, the fascism analogy, obviously, with the Daleks with their plungers in the air, and that the Cybermen are very obviously men in suits.
Yeah, so that's the big problem, isn't it?
Yeah, they don't have that kind of iconic nature of that. It's not as easy to just go and draw a Cyberman as it is to just do a quick 10-second sketch of a Dalek, for instance. So I don't kind of think they were. I think,
on the other hand,
yeah,
you do get like 6 Cyberman stories in a row with Patrick Troughton, pretty much. Well, one with William Hartnell, followed by 5. I think it's 5. Is it 4 with Patrick Troughton? There's a bunch anyway. They come along like twice a year almost for the next couple of years after the 10th Planet. But I guess the sort of subtext to this question is, are those stories coming along because people are clamouring for the Cybermen, or just because the people who are writing the programme have run out of ideas?
And they've got a nice, easy kit peddler in there too, who will happily provide them with those ideas. I think there's a lot to that one, yes. I think the thing with the Cybermen is they do kind of have a slight resonance behind them, which is that threat of science, the almost kind of Luddite thing. Because they are what happens when, particularly if you get the prologues in the books, they gradually replace each of them. They make themselves less human. So there is a kind of resonance that kind of goes against the grain of the more kind of utopian SF of the time, I'd say.
I question how much those prologues actually end up in the
stories
themselves.
Not at all, I don't think.
Well, bits and pieces in Tomb, I guess. And there are, but it's really the 80s where body horror becomes popular and tolerated. That's when you start to actually see the horror of conversion. And even then, it's sort of controversial.
Well, here's an addendum to the question then, Matt. If the Daleks hadn't been the popular constant throughout Doctor Who, and if the Cybermen had taken off to a degree in the second half of the 60s instead, do you think we'd have had the same sort of stories where they basically just come up with a story and stick the Cybermen in it, as opposed to extrapolating a story out of the Cybermen? Or do they take that premise of the Cybermen and actually do something with it instead?
I don't think so. I think the Cybermen are effectively humanoid. They're humanoid robots and it's such a cliche, it's such a science fiction cliche. So it's really the prologues of the books that make them distinctive, but on screen they're not that distinctive. But I would argue that it is possible to have the conversation, what if Ridley Scott designed the Daleks instead of Cusick? Because that raises the question of how important is the specific design of the Daleks to their popularity, and alternatively, how much was the audience ready for something like the Daleks, regardless of design? So if we're talking about, so if we go with an alien that doesn't look human, that essentially works in the same way as the Dalek, but looks completely different from the Dalek, would that still be as popular as that Dalek? And I think it would. I don't think that particular design is necessarily what made the Daleks popular. I think it's just they hadn't seen anything like that on screen for a while. That sort of battle tank look.
Well, we've got two examples of things that happened basically kind of in parallel with the Daleks that we can draw upon. And one is the mechanoids. And okay, the Daleks have already got the popularity. But if you look at the mechanoids, that's the sort of design department's attempt to do something that can sort of parallel the Daleks and it really doesn't work. The mechanoids are rubbish, frankly. I mean, I've got a couple of toy mechanoids and they're lovely things to have, but my God, they're rubbish. But the other thing that I think is slightly more pertinent is in the 60s, the Mini really took off, and the Mini is regarded as a design classic. And that is specifically for the look and the shape of the Mini, rather than just because it's a car, because essentially, you know, a Mini is just like any other car, but the Mini becomes sort of indelibly linked to sort of swinging 60s-ness because specifically of the design. And yeah, I can see where you're coming from, but I do wonder, I do think there's something specific to Raymond Cusick's design of the Daleks that becomes a sort of 60s design classic in the same way as the Mini is. I think
so. Don't the ratings for the Daleks increase over that first story? So you've got that. I know the legend is that Terry Nation had people phoning you out when they'd seen, you know, that sink plunger, but it's when you see that design, that's when it takes off. That's when the ratings go through the roof. So I think that suggests to me,
but it's difficult.
It's a visual element.
But it's difficult to disentangle whether it's the design that entranced people or the idea and the story that entranced people and the general look. And then the design becomes classic because it's everywhere. And then mechanoids and war machines are obviously going to be sort of inferior to that Dalek design, but that's because the Daleks were so popular.
And I think they did try to for others to take off as well. You know, particularly Zarbi had a bit of heft behind them and never got anywhere. No. Even the Vord in the annuals, you know, and then you didn't see anything of them until the World Shapers in '87 in the strip.
Yeah.
Well, the question that comes subsequent about the Dalek design is every time they tweak it, we take against it. But do we take against it because it's not as good as the original design, or do we take against it because we are so used to that original design that anything that's slightly different just looks wrong?
I think it's the latter.
And I guess it's the latter, yeah.
Yeah, because I think I'm trying to think if there's anything, and it's so difficult to sort of divorce yourself from the idea that this is an amazing design, that Cusick's design is amazing and fantastic, because it's become amazing and fantastic. It's become symbolic and iconic. But is it really? Could somebody else have come along, or one of the Benson's books, the early years, where you see like the different designs of Dalek? Any of those could potentially, if they'd managed to build them, could have worked in the same way and become as popular.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a question.
I think what you need is a silhouette as much as anything. You've got a strong silhouette. And the reason say the 2010 Dalek redesign didn't work for a lot of people, it changed that silhouette. You had that humpback rather than that kind of those elegant lines.
Yeah, but are they elegant lines? I mean, one thing.
You can sketch straight the Dalek inside 10 seconds.
in my defense against my own argument, I think what Daleks are good is for putting color on screen when they're in the films. There's lots of places where they can be colored and they have texture and they actually have interest in them. They're not just sort of, tin foil.
Yes, it's not a uniform design from head to toe. It's a design that's different on every level, and that's one of the great things about it. It's different, but it works together. He really managed to find something that worked together, and it could have been awful, but it wasn't. It was brilliant. But look, we're supposed to be doing what if, and we've gone down an absolute tangent of not what ifness.
You're welcome.
Or I guess tangential what ifness. But I want to do a sort of follow-up short question, and then I've got a bigger question to follow with that we might spend like 20 or 30 minutes on. So let's do the shorter one first. And the shorter one is this: if Terry Nation, and I'm going to stick with Daleks, if Terry Nation hadn't revoked the BBC's rights to use the Daleks in 1967, and they'd have just come back year after year between then and 1972, when they do finally come back, I'm not going to ask, would they have lost their popularity? Because I don't think that's the case. What I'm saying instead is, if you'd have had an unbroken run of at least one Dalek, if not two Dalek stories every year between 1963 and like 1975, when you get to Genesis of the Daleks, I'm asking, what would the Dalek stories in the years that became the fallow years have looked like? So the last proper one we get is Evil of the Daleks, that's written by David Whittaker. And then when they come back, it's Louis Marks, and that's an accidental thing because Barry Letts hasn't made contact with Terry Nation, but Terry Nation becomes the Dalek writer after that. And I suppose where I'm going to start in answer to this question is, if Terry Nation doesn't take the rights with him to America in the hope of selling scripts to America and getting a career there, I think he stays in Britain and starts writing the Dalek stories again himself. So I think they go from Evil of the Daleks back to that sort of boy's own adventuring paradigm from Dalek's master plan. So over to you. What do you think the Dalek stories that you would have had between 67 and 72, maybe 3 of them, maybe 4 of them, what do you think they might have been like, John?
I think the first one, simply because the way the production worked, was that Jerry Davis liked that one big set and a couple of little ones off it for economic reasons. So I think what you'd have seen would be something maybe slightly similar to Power in Season 5, but more of a base under siege from the Dalek story. So, a group of besieged humans and Daleks trying to break something down. Where would you have put it? Maybe on lines of kind of where the Ice Warriors are, I suppose.
Or possibly even on a spaceship. And it might have resembled Wheel in Space, because if Terry Nation had come back, he'd have probably wanted to use the Secret Space Service or whatever he calls them from Dalek's master plan again. So it might have made sense to sort of set it on a giant space station that becomes infiltrated by Daleks, right?
Absolutely. And then maybe with Trenton, I think if you've still got Daleks available, you don't get the war games. You get a Dalek. You would have maybe got a Dalek finale, because they're the obvious big thing. Because that, I believe, there's a thought at the time, it might be the last Doctor Who story. So how else would you end Doctor Who?
Well, and you know what? You wouldn't necessarily not combine the two, because most of the time we see the Daleks, and people seem to forget this, but I think it's a truism. Most of the time they're actually using humans or humanoids for one thing or another. Robo-Man, I mean, even to an extent the Thals, but Robo-Man, and sort of like, in the Stephen Moffat stories, you've got the ones with the Dalek eye stalks and their forehead, and in between you've got all sorts of other things, Destiny of the Daleks, and so on and so forth.
It really fits with, say, David Whittaker's conception of the Daleks there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So you could have had the war games, but with the Daleks instead of the war chief and the war commander or whatever.
Yeah, they come in sometime around episode 7 to boss everyone around.
Precisely. Matt, what do you think the Dalek stories of the latter 1960s might have looked like?
That's what I would have thought.
Okay,
that was my one idea. Season 7, I struggle to imagine
they don't fit, do they?
Going with the Daleks for season 7. There's a conscious effort to ground it, unless they do another Invasion Earth thing.
Unless they do something along the lines of Dalek or resolution where you've got a lone Dalek that somehow turns up on Earth. We could have had that way back in 1970. I think that would have fit with the sort of ethos of season 7 to a degree. I mean, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to know how they would have done it without, actually seeing what they would have done. But I can see that fitting. Season 7 could have been 5 stories rather than 4, and the Dalek story could have been an extra one, and then the other 3 stories could have been 5 episodes each or something.
Sure. And then the Daleks are back, aren't they, the next season? Or are they not?
No, 2 years later.
After?
They would have been.
Okay.
There'd have been
the
one in
Master
season
season
8
between.
But,
So you got Frontier in space, basically,
And
or the
season
Master
8
invading
is the-
Earth in conjunction with the Daleks, a Claws of Axos type,
Yeah.
team up.
Oh, Claws of Axos with the Daleks, which would have echoed
Yes.
power. That's a
I mean,
potentiality.
it wouldn't be that much of a difference, really. There's not that many years. It must have felt by the time the Daleks were made that they'd been off air for years and years. But actually now we get that length of gap between individual seasons of Doctor Who, so it's sort of that's all fine.
Yeah, we certainly do at the moment. Yes, like I say, that was just a little question because it was a sort of Dalek follow-up question. Okay, here's the big question for this episode, and this is a discussion. This is a proper discussion. If the BBC hadn't cancelled Doctor Who in 1989, or rather if the plan for Doctor Who in 1989 had come to fruition rather than frittering out, what would Doctor Who have looked like in the years between 1989 and 2005? And what I'm asking us to do is to imagine how you get from Survival to Rose, because I think Rose and Russell T Davies is basically where Doctor Who would have been in 2005, even if it hadn't got off the air. But it wouldn't have been such a shock of the change from the classic series if we'd have had it all the way through. It would have been a gradual sort of process of evolution. And the reason I brought this up is because although we like to think the BBC cancelled Doctor Who in 1989, that's not true. What happened was the BBC wanted to stop making it in 1989, and they wanted to buy it in from an outside independent company who would make it for them. They just struggled to find a company that they trusted to do it, who would do it under the sort of aegis of a BBC deal where the merchandising rights would stay with the BBC rather than go to the independent producer. So in the end, they couldn't find anybody to do it until 1996. But that wasn't for the want of trying. There were lots of attempts in those years to bring Doctor Who back to the screen. So what I'm basically saying is, imagine in 1989 Doctor Who does stop, but imagine it comes back in 1991 with an independent producer. What does that first season back look like? Is it 25s? Is it 45s? Is it a really short season of 6? Is it a long season of 26?
So I think I think for me there are 2 routes into answering, or at least starting to think about the question, 2 potential routes. The first is New Adventures, Missing Adventures, 8th Doctor Adventures, that sort of cadre of writers, because we can see Aronovich, Mark Platt, we can see lots of these writers, Paul Cornell starting to work.
Before you go on, of course, those books wouldn't have happened if the series hadn't gone off the air. But what you're saying is those writers might have ended up on the series instead of doing the books.
I think Paul Cornell's got his Children's War credit by then as well, so they're all TV writers.
Yeah. So we start, and Russell T Davies as well. So we start to see the potential writers. The other route to answering the question is the endless TV series that they brought in to try and effectively replace Doctor Who, like Bugs and Crime Traveller and Strange, and I mean, who knows what else? There are countless ones, and that would give you an idea of the look and the direction and the format. I think New Adventures is a bit too adult. I don't think the TV would have go down New Adventures. I think it would be a muted, more controlled. So you get Ben Aronovich not writing Transit, but being kind of kept tamped down by a good script editor and a cautious producer, just to make sure he's writing, family drama. But at least you've got names. which is one start.
I think with the other thing with the New Adventures is that they're written largely by fan writers, or writers from fan background, rather, I should say. And I don't think a series would go that way.
I don't know.
Again, something Lawrence Miles said when it's 2005, came back in 2005. The thing that he was dreading was they went down the fan route. They went down the European fans rather than a general audience. I think there would have been elements of it because it's starting to click in.
Well, yes, it was already starting in the Cartmel years, wasn't it? And I think that's it. I think this is the first time a program, other than a soap, has made it to such longevity that people who've grown up with it and become fans of it and then developed into a writing career in television would have had the chance to. So I don't know. I think they would have.
Green might have been close enough.
Well, how long did Dixon and Doc Green run? Not 26 years, was it?
It's 20 something years.
Yeah.
Gunsmoke is the other one I can think of on US TV. But
sure. But it's very
you're
rare.
Not wrong, though. Yeah, and that only really kicks in right at the end of the Who can anyway. I know you can say Douglas Adams was the first.
What I think you need,
Smith, but yeah, go on.
What I think you need is a really strong identity for the independent production company and a really thoroughgoing deal between them and the BBC, so that when they employ writers, they can employ fan writers, but say, look, we appreciate you're a fan, but we don't want to aim this at fans. We want to aim this at the general public, in basically the same way you had with BBC Wales and Russell T Davies in 2005. So I don't know.
Opportunity to develop, at least, I think, for the writers, you'd hope.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's right to the end on Doctor Who itself. Because Cartmel goes out and finds these writers as much as anything else.
I think the key also is fan writers of Doctor Who are great, so long as the fan side generally comes through with enthusiasm rather than content. So what Doctor Who was potentially lacking during the Sayward years was sort of enthusiasm or interest in the show. He didn't seem to be that interested in Doctor Who as a concept and more interested in his own sort of ideas. Whereas Cartmel bringing on ex-fans or fans and sort of he mined their enthusiasm, their kind of sentimental attachment to the show. But the McCoy years, I mean, Remembrance was a bit sort of fan service, but they weren't kind of bottom feeding from the past in the McCoy years. They were kind of referencing the past in a way that was accessible.
No, that's it. If you bring somebody in from outside and say this program's got a 26-year history, the person who's from the outside who doesn't know much about the show might be tempted to go into that history and use something from that history just as a kind of touching point with the series, so that they've got a handle on what they're doing. Whereas somebody who's grown up as a Doctor Who fan has grown up with all the times Doctor Who introduces new things, and they've got their own new things that they want to introduce into Doctor Who.
Unless you're John Peel.
Nice. Apart from Eric Sayward, though, and you can see it since, every kind of writer, even Chris Bidney before him, has a strong idea of what they want to do with the series. And Eric Sayward didn't really have that. So what you'd hope is that if they go for an independent production company, I think certainly Verity Lambert pitched for it, didn't she? I think maybe, or she asked to be
Terry Nation. Yeah, Terry Nation did. Terry Davis did.
Joe Davis. Yeah. And you'd hope they have a really strong idea of what they want to do with the series ahead of, we want to put the Daleks on screen, or but they don't want.
That's key.
Tell a good story.
But that's key as well. This is why actually that's probably a good idea to go to an external production company, because they have to pitch for it. So it's not just a case of finding the person who agrees to be the producer after John Nathan Turner. It's actually companies that have to basically apply for the job with story ideas. And that's what Russell T Davies had to do, didn't he? He had a pitch document and he actually had to sell the idea. And that's one, I think, reason why it was so successful. He wasn't crowned king of Doctor Who. He was sort of, he was put through the paces to see if this idea had legs, and he had to, outline his plan for the whole season. And that never really happened on Doctor Who. That didn't happen with John Nathan Turner. He was just moved into the role.
Yeah. Different structure in the BBC at the time. And I think as well, if we go into the question of what the series might have looked like, I think it would have gone, as Matt alluded to, with the stuff they used to replace it. I think it would have gone to 45 minutes very quickly.
Pretty quickly, yeah.
Because Doctor Who, I think, is the last drama that's made at that 25-minute length. You know, taking soap operas out of the equation, but it's the last primetime drama that's made on a 25 minutes on VT.
I think they'd moved. Sorry. I had a never cough in my throat there.
And it's a question, would
of course Sky wanted loads of things afterwards, like Jupiter Moon, that were in the 25-minute format, so it didn't entirely die.
We mentioned Jupiter Moon twice in a few podcasts here.
Well, that's what put it in my head, the fact that we mentioned it the other day. But yeah, but Jupiter Moon was 25, so it didn't die out entirely. But yeah, the more prestigious you were, the more likely you were to be 45s or 50s. And so it makes sense that as soon as an independent, because they'd already tried the 45 on Doctor Who, and it wasn't that the 45 failed, it was just that nobody had the wherewithal to decide whether to keep it up or not, so they reverted back to what had been the standard, really. And so I think an independent
and it is also that Eric Saywood didn't know how to structure a story in that length.
Yeah. See Time Lash, which is basically 2 25-minute episodes with padding.
So it would have been 45s almost certainly from the off if it had been an independent production company doing it for 91 or 92 or whatever. Would it have been 6 episodes or 12 episodes? I wonder if it might have started at 6 episodes, because that basically is the equivalent of where Doctor Who left off in the classic series anyway. And it may have expanded upwards to 8 or 10 if it had been successful, I think. I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Well, Doctor Who essentially is making what I think at the top it makes 8 or 9 stories a year usually, and Doctor Who is essentially trying to put together however many different movies a year.
Yes, but back then,
but
it
even go
4,
back then,
5, 6.
4, 5,
the
6,
most
and 4 to finish. But yeah, I think it's 9
stories,
is the most, isn't it? Off my head.
No, in the
stories
80s,
rather than episodes.
7 is the most, but most of them are
7 is the
sort
most,
of 6.
at the start of the decade. I think it does go to that, because you've got to lay out on the different locations, on the different casts. I think it does go to, but it might go to 6 stories, but it might go to 12 episodes or something like that. Purely, to amortize the cost, you get twice the amount of TV for that much.
Oh, sure, but it could have been 3 stories with 6 episodes at 45.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I'm using the fans go mad yet again.
So using my stated methodology, I'm looking at Bugs, and Bugs obviously 45-minute episodes, I think, were they?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and they made 10 episodes per season, but Bugs would have been cheaper to make than Doctor Who because it's all contemporary. But
yes,
Doctor Who would potentially still want 2-part stories, so maybe 5 stories across 10 episodes would be the same budget as Bugs, potentially, because you're only effectively changing the look 5 times. That would be
like that. Something like Cracker did 2-part stories. So
yeah.
Okay, there's 3 sort of follow-up questions to this. Let's say it goes to an independent, and the independent's doing it from 91, and let's say they're on a 5-year contract to make 5 seasons. At the end of those 5 years, so this doesn't correspond exactly in time, at the end of those 5 years, does it get another 2-year rest and then come back as an American co-pro? So essentially you get the TV movie as a sort of pilot. Let's say you run 91 to 96, then you take 97 off, 98 you get a variation of the TV movie, and then 99 to 2000 or so, let's say, you get American series that look like. Do you think that's a possibility if Doctor Who runs, that they find an American co-pro, or do you think it stays in-house in Britain? Because I think there's a big temptation to go to America if they're doing it with independence on sort of finite contracts. I think that's a big temptation.
That one's really difficult, because part of the attraction, of course, was that Philip Scout kind of had Steven Spielberg's imprimatur behind him. Yeah.
Mm.
So I mean that was all boiling away in the background during the early 90s as well, of course.
Well, this is it. If Doctor Who's in a co-pro for 5 years,
it's the money, I think.
That's not to say that there's not a lot of talk going on in the background about who might be next. So all of these things could be set up behind closed doors just to roll on one from another. I don't know.
It's a different process for an existing TV program to
then
get an American series. If a program's, as Doctor Who has been off air for 7 years, then that's I think a harder sell. And didn't Doctor Who sort of start taking off again in the 90s in America? Isn't that the sort of, or maybe the 80s it was? That's when Patrick Troughton kept going to Chicago and appearing on fundraising.
I think you can overstate that, though. I don't think
it's PBS, so it's a kind of a significant but minor concern. It's then more than a cult program best.
And of course, the thing is, Seagal had been talking to the BBC, I think, before it had even gone off the air. His first conversations were back in the 80s, weren't they? So it's not like he wanted to bring it back because it had been off air. He wanted to do it straight away. In fact, it could have been that he took it over in 1990, potentially. Didn't happen.
Do you keep it running through on the UK TV through the 90s, but then have in parallel a US version running? Say, do you sell the format over?
Could do. I mean, lots of other series have done it. It would be very expensive for the Americans to take on, and they might balk at the idea of taking on something that's already a success elsewhere if they're spending that much money on it. But the flip side of that is, if it's a big success elsewhere, that might be the reason why they want to spend money on it. So yeah, it's entirely possible that could happen. And do you know what? I mean, just on a side note, I would welcome that, because I'd love there to be 2 series of Doctor Who running at the same time. Just like I love the fact that there's 2 series of Ghosts running at the same time. I like the American one. It's not as good as the British one, but I like it. I certainly don't have any snobbery about it. I just think twice as much Ghosts. What's there to complain about?
If you get it right, it's always good. God, what was it? Sanford and Son and
Farnaby and that are in charge of, not in charge of, but they have a lot of input on the American Ghosts. So they're keeping an eye to make sure it's doing what Ghosts should do, basically, I suppose.
Or you get something like The Office, where it becomes very much its own thing over the course of its run.
For sure. And I suspect that'll probably happen with Ghosts too, because they are doing sort of 20 a year. Anyway, look, the 2 other questions are, and I'll ask them both at the same time, basically, the companion and the Doctor. So I suppose the obvious question with the Doctor is, when it comes back, they're erring on the side of younger Doctors. The BBC had already done that in the 80s with Peter Davison. And of course, Colin Baker and Sylvester McCoy were neither of them old Doctors. They were, I guess, both not within a million miles of Christopher Eccleston, really.
About the same age, they're born mid-40s, so yeah. So I guess what I'm asking about the Doctor is, do the Doctors start airing towards younger Doctors as the series? I mean, if it's being made by an independent production company, they're going to want, I would have thought, to have a very definite leading man in the leading role, as opposed to a character actor necessarily. So there's a balance to be struck there, much like when the Americans cast Paul McGann. And the question about the companion is, already, many people have made the allusion between Ace at the end of the classic series and Rose at the start of the modern run. I guess what I'm asking is, that thing now of it being an earthbound contemporary companion who takes off with the Doctor, so we can see the story through the eyes of somebody we recognize and can identify with, is that something that becomes pretty much continuous, more or less, throughout these sort of 15 years where we hadn't had Doctor Who? And I'm trying to remember what they do in the novels, and I think in the novels you get groups of companions where you can have an alien or somebody from the past or the future. But I think with the novels, by and large, there's generally somebody relatively contemporary there too, a lot of the time. Well, the New Adventures, you got Benny, Chris and Roz, who are all from the far future. But
Right.
Sam Jones is contemporary. Angie Fitz is 60s, so well within the thing. So
Right.
yeah, there is.
Those are the BBC
usually,
books ones, right?
Yeah, the BBC books one. So that usually there is someone on board who is relative contemporary after New Adventures.
So that's my question. Is that what happens on TV? Go on, Matt. Sorry.
And also, contemporary doesn't just mean from the present, but has contemporary attitude. So Bernice Summerfield is from the far future, but she's basically a contemporary character.
Emma Thompson from The Tour Guide, of course, being the inspiration.
Yeah. Right. So is that what happens then on the telly, do we think?
I think the Doctor, I think one path to an answer is looking at the auditions for the TV movie, because the people who didn't get the Doctor in the TV movie are the people who are maybe quite hot in the 90s, or possibly the people you could turn to. So I'm thinking maybe not Tony Slattery, but I'm thinking who else? Liam Cunningham was.
Tony Head was on.
Yeah, Anthony Head.
John Sessions.
John Sessions auditions. Yeah, you can see his audition. So maybe they would have been in line for it. So not hugely famous outside of Britain, but young enough to take it on.
I think you're looking at someone maybe who has the potential to break out, so to speak. It's almost the way they are today. You cast David Tennant, well known but not a star. Again, Matt Smith,
Jesse Birdsall.
There you go. Craig McLachlan.
Yeah.
So I guess to finish, Russell T Davies, maybe he writes Damaged Goods or a variation thereof for the telly.
No.
An approximation. Yeah. An approximation. Yes, of course. Oh, I know what it's about, but I mean, you can take
tone is
Yes, exactly. But look at the tone he brings to Doctor Who. So all I'm saying is,
if you, I just put he would, and I think this is one of the places it would have gone regardless. He takes it into that kind of contemporary, that late 80s Manchester. He takes it into the contemporary, that contemporary milieu, the council estates, rather than the suburbs that we leave the show in 1989.
Oh, I tell you what. Here's another question before we do finish. Might they have tried the season-long story, and would they have got story arcs across the season like Russell T Davies does?
Not until America starts doing it. Not until after Babylon 5.
Possibly even the Buffy kind of era. But the story arcs, they kind of are a part of British television, so it could possibly have been in there.
I mean, it's like, if you look at something like, I guess, Blake 7, which is kind of a story of the week. There's a story of the week, but the enemy is always the same, and the story always revolves around how can we do something about this enemy. So essentially, although it's a story of the week, it kind of forms a slightly larger story, and especially in that first series of Blake 7, where the team are coming together right up until almost the last episode when you get Aurak or whatever. So there is the Blake 7 first season, you can't show them out of order, is what I'm saying, because there are things that follow on from one episode to another, with a couple of exceptions.
It's character more than anything with Blake 7. I know there is the Star 1 thing towards the end of season 2.
But what I'm saying is, in Doctor Who, already with Ace, that's starting to come in before it falls off the screen. If it stays on the screen, does that become more of a thing?
And you can tell it's coming in because they mangled season 26 by showing them out of order.
Yeah.
Slightly. And season 25.
Yeah, both of those two seasons. Yeah, season 26 is more egregious, though, because that's where there's an actual arc between 3 stories that then get shown in the wrong order, such that the arc doesn't quite make sense anymore. And I don't think that gets dropped. I think that becomes so that when Russell T Davies comes back, he probably has to push it slightly further, actually. Otherwise, he ends up just looking like Doctor Who already looks. But then maybe Russell T Davies comes in and wants to look like Doctor Who already looks, but just wants to give it his tone. Who knows?
Because he's pitched for Mind of the Hodiak, didn't he, in 85, 86-ish? 86, I think.
And they submitted a pitch in 2000, didn't they?
There were a lot of pitches.
99, 2000, he and the others did Doctor Who 2000 or something like that.
There is a pitch. There are a load of pitches. There's one from Gareth Roberts, Clayton Hickman, and Mark Gatiss, which is terrible. Honestly, it's very cozy 70s tea time aimed stuff, and it doesn't work at all.
Hopefully, it's all filmed in Aldbourne, as Doctor Who should always be filmed, even if it's on green screen.
It really could. It was set in Doctor Who's this mysterious old wizard in a village.
Brilliant.
Yeah, but then going back to my question of would there have been a season-long story arc? Might we have had something like? Not too dissimilar from BBC Books, where the Doctor loses the TARDIS and becomes the wizard in the village for a year before heading back into the stars at the end of the season when the TARDIS turns up at the end of the last episode. You could have had things like that. So it is a story of the week, but at the same time, it's more contained than Doctor Who usually is. And maybe while he's stuck in that village, you have an enemy who's there from the start to the finish, because otherwise it starts to look suspiciously like that village is the most invaded place in the entire universe for no very good reason. So I don't know. I don't know definitely whether I think those things would have happened, but I certainly think if Doctor Who runs continuously, and by the time you get to the end of those 15 years, that's 40 years worth of Doctor Who. I think if it runs continuously for that time, they're probably starting to get more experimental as it goes on. Much like, I suppose, with things like Trial of a Time Lord.
The interesting thing to me is, do you, through that period, do you bring in the past of the show, specifically with, do you have, say, the multi-Doctor stories for the 30th and the 40th? Would that have happened?
I think it would, but they didn't do it for 25. But they didn't do it for 25 because they'd very successfully done it for 20 just a few years before, and Doctor Who was on its downers for 25. But I think if you've already done it for the 3 Doctors and you've done it slightly differently for the 5, so the 5 is a celebration, whereas the 3 was an experiment. I think you do the experiment on 20, you do the celebration. On 30, you do let's try it a different way, and on the 40, you do let's try it a different way again, so that you can do a celebration again on 50, maybe. But 30 is not as big a one as 20, and 40 is not a bigger one as 25 or something. So I don't know. I think there'd have been something, but I suspect they'd have done it slightly differently. I think the outlier is the 2 Doctors, because John Nathan Turner brings back Patrick Troughton for no very good reason whatsoever. But the 2 Doctors might have been an inkling of how they might have dealt with the 30th anniversary, so that you maybe do get a Doctor or a couple of Doctors back, but you get them back for different reasons and do something different with the story. I've always said, or I've not always said, and I don't think I've ever said it on the podcast, but one way to do an anniversary where you can give each of the Doctors an amount of time on screen that's substantial, rather than just have them all be in each other's stories, is to do a mini-series where Peter Capaldi does an episode with Matt Smith, and an episode with David Tennant, and an episode with Christopher Eccleston, and an episode with Paul McGann, and then in the finale, the 2-part finale, does an episode with all of those others. So in the finale, they're all aware going in that they're not going to get as much substance, but they each get a full episode first in order to shine. And I don't
that's
know,
the Sirens of Time, isn't it? Does that
does that how they
finish
do
story?
that?
Yeah, it's
Right,
it's
fair enough,
it's
yeah.
5, 6, 7, and then all 3 together in the last episode, which
Right,
seems to be
awful.
It's an awful. It's not a very good story, but I think the structure's great.
Yeah.
Right, sure. You see, and you could easily do something along those lines, I guess, which would be a different way. See what I mean? I think they would have experimented with different ways of doing it, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right. Any more that anybody wants to bring up about any of those thoughts, or any more questions that have arisen out of that have popped into anybody's heads? Or am I going to make a joke about what we might do next time? And
what will we do next
actually do it next time?
Yes.
Well, I actually, because I thought, oh my God, if we're going to do this on a monthly basis, I'm going to have a few ideas. So I've actually written down like 9 or 10 ideas. So, okay, continuing the Daleks without Destiny theme, what about if Russell T Davies had written, or not Russell T Davies, Rob Shearman had written a story with a single Toclafane landing in Utah in an underground base in 2005 rather than Dalek? Maybe that's a question we can ask at the start of the next episode.
Okay.
Until we do that, I was JR.
I was Matt.
And I was John.
And we will speak again soon.